let's get the show on the road. I reckon. I think we're ticked over to a minute past 7 o'clock. So I'd like to welcome everybody to this edition of this month's Charged Chat. My name's Tim. I'm from Charge Garage. I drive an electric Cortina Mark I, and I work in the EV fast charging field. We've got 3 experts on the panel with us tonight. I'd like to introduce Mark from Electric Vehicle Canberra, who's a EV charging conversion expert. Hi, Mark.
Hello, how are you? Very
well. We've also got our long-standing expert, Conrad Gibb from EV Talk. How are you, Conrad?
Good, Tim. Yeah. Hello, Mark. Hello, Peter. Hello, everyone listening in around the world to this month's webinar. Should be very interesting. And we have a special guest that Tim's going to introduce.
Our special guest tonight is Peter Wescott, who is undertaking a very interesting EV conversion on his Austin Healey Sprite. Welcome, Peter.
Hey, thanks everyone for having me. It's a real pleasure and a buzz to be here.
And I can see there's attendees chiming in from all around the world, so that's fantastic. Feel free to pop in your where you're attending from and say hello. Pop any questions into the Q&A box. Make sure that it's noted to everyone, unless it's specifically for the panelists. If you just want to say hello, then use the chat button, and that's another little box where you can chat and share information. We are obviously all muted to avoid the background noise, and we are recording the presentation so that you can review it on YouTube at a later date and allow other people who can't chime in right now to join in or to view it at a later date. But it's always great having people on board live so that we can talk and discuss and answer questions in real time. So let's get underway. So one of the questions that we're going to talk about tonight is about range, which is often probably the number one question that people will ask when you drive an electric car is how far can it go? And since we're in the field of making our own EVs or designing and fabricating and designing our battery packs for these EV conversions, we can actually work out how much range or build our projects to suit the range that we need. So let's try and talk about what type of battery size you need for the conversion that we want to do. So I think the first question is what type of driving will you be doing? So Mark, have you got any initial thoughts before we get into the actual numbers of kilowatt hours per kilometer of range? Thoughts about actual driving styles and that will affect range?
The big ones for me is sort of the weight, because we've worked with a Parenti, and which is a big Land Rover, and now I'm working with a GMC van. The other big one is drag. So it's good to have a good guess based on some of the the parameters I think that we're going to be looking at in a sec. But obviously, if you're driving a barn door around, it's going to have a big effect on it.
Conrad?
Yeah, I agree, Mark. And I think it's a bit like owning a Tesla. When Tesla say it does X amount of kilometers, it's not always the case because everyone drives differently, up hills, down hills, fast, slow, lots of people, lots of weight, and so your battery requirements can vary a lot. And I think now with the event of fast charging or rapid charging for our northern hemisphere people, I don't think we need to carry around kilos or pounds of battery to achieve our destinations. We can rapid charge like Tim does with his Cortina. So yeah, I think you've got to have that sort of mixture. What do you think, Peter?
Sorry, mouthful of Easter egg. For me, the notion of range is almost redundant in an urban context because charge points are so close together. You almost have to want to run out of range to run out. My personal perspective is how much range can I get on a highway cruise, because I often go to Sydney, and so I need to know how far I can get at cruising speed on the highway, which is relatively constant speed, and you can get a pretty good idea from there. So, and I think behaviour is changing generally in society about charging up. You charge your phone everywhere you can, you charge this and that wherever you can, you charge your EV wherever you can in an urban context. But I think where it really comes to the crunch is when you're in an out of urban context. And one thing that comes immediately to mind is that if I'm in this EV Sprite that I'm building and I want to drive to Sydney, I've actually got to go to, I can't even make it to Euroa where the fast charger is. I've got to stop once, charge, top up in Euroa, and then I might get to Albury. And so for me, that's the critical thing about range.
Yeah, most people may have a required route that they need to do, or they think that they need 300 kilometers or 500 kilometers because they do that, one weekend a year, but it's not necessarily what you should be designing your battery pack for. EV fast charging infrastructure is growing rapidly all around Australia, which is it's early days still, but it will help reduce the need for that large battery pack. And what you should be designing for is your daily range, if you're going to use it as a daily car, or what you would do on a normal weekend without needing to stop for it and charge up. But it's also dependent on what you can fit in your car, in your converted car, and weight aspects. So we'll get to those aspects, but let's look at some of the industry standards for production EVs. Tesla Model 3 is one of the most popular EVs out in the market. It uses around 15 kilowatt hours per 100 kilometers, which is not the most efficient production EV on the market. I think the Hyundai Ioniq is one of the most efficient at almost down to 12 kilowatt hours per 100 kilometers. But these are finely tuned, engineered to a very high level production EVs. So you can't expect to achieve the same type of efficiency figures that we're seeing here in a converted EV. But it's good to know what the industry standards are. Any other comments? Well, actually, let's start looking at EV conversion. So this is my Cortina, and a good target or a rule of thumb is to allow approximately 20 kilowatt hours for 100 kilometers of range. In real world, on average been achieving around 16 kilowatt hours per 100 kilometers. But that's Cortina is a fairly light car. The aerodynamic coefficient isn't terribly great, but it's not as bad as some of the other cars. But when designing, I think that 20 kilowatt hours per 100 kilometers of range is a good benchmark. Conrad, have you got any experience from other converted cars that you've done?
Yeah, I think definitely good 20 kilowatts per 100 when you're out on the highway trying to do 100 kilometers an hour. And you actually find you probably back off down to 90, 95. Well, you just find that sweet spot, and every vehicle's different, where you get your current usage down a bit. So, or you get very clever at tailgating trucks and caravans that are breaking the wind for you, I guess. So no, I totally agree. It's I guess what there really should be is, I've always wondered this, whether there should be a range for highway and a range for city, but like the old ICE vehicles have, they have a city use and a highway
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, because highway range is when you really need the range if you're going long distances, but it's when the range gets eaten up a lot faster because you're traveling at those higher speeds.
What do you think? Yeah, what do you think, Mark?
I think, well, I'm probably in a different sort of area, because I'm looking at now with having a work vehicle. I need around about 200 Ks for a day's work. So I'm not doing highway stuff. I'm doing stop start, and the vehicle's on the road all day. So I'm probably a little bit different to your average sort of EV user at the moment. And I think that's going to be another factor that we'll have to look at. But I like your idea as well, that it really, especially if we're normalizing EVs in the future, having comparisons just like the ICE do with different expectations, I think it sort of makes it sort of standard and what everybody's used to. So, but yeah, those figures look pretty good. The other option I did too with the van was, I was lucky enough to have a car that already had been converted across in the 90s. And I did the rough estimates based on lead acid batteries, which were originally in it, factored a little bit of extra life, or a little bit of extra discharge, because lead acid's kind of rubbish. And I've also got a little less weight. So I found using other vehicles and comparing, I don't know if people use EV album very much nowadays, but certainly I've looked at what other people have gotten with similar sorts of cars and used that to help work out range as well.
Great stuff. There's a question about air conditioning. I have put air conditioning in my Cortina, but it uses very little battery power, or obviously it's not like traditional ICE engines where you lose a bit of horsepower, because we're running a high voltage air conditioning compressor straight off the battery pack. We lose a tiny bit of range, but it's minuscule, because it's only using maybe 7 or 8 amps even to run the compressor. So I hardly see any reduction in range using air conditioning. Speaking of battery packs, we were on an, I thought we had changed slides. Sorry, there we go. Tesla modules are popular in EV conversions. One of the reasons I chose to use Tesla battery packs is because, well, I had access to them by purchasing and stripping out written off Tesla cars, which is a useful source for Tesla batteries. But the main reason why they're sought after is because of their power to density and range to density ratios. So you get a good amount of range out of the weight that each module has. They might not necessarily be the most convenient form factor and size for some vehicles, but in terms of weight versus capacity, they're probably the best on the market. Conrad?
Yeah, totally agree. I just wish there were more of them, and they're getting rare as hen's teeth now. Well, especially for the price. And I guess, with all conversions, even the DIY conversions, I'd probably say that the battery would be the single biggest cost of the conversion. We do a few lithium iron phosphate batteries, and they're a little bit cheaper, a little bit, I'd say bulletproof, I suppose. But yeah, like you say, the Tesla modules are definitely king. The LG, we've done a few LG conversions for the higher performance stuff, and they're beautiful. But they certainly still don't have the density of the Tesla modules. What did you use in the Parenti, Mark?
We've been using the Samsung clones, the NMC SDI batteries. So look, pretty well, and somebody's just typed up, they're similar to the i3 ones from my understanding. But what I do like about them, again, is the form factor thing. The ones we get have really nice packages around them, so they have easy to construct. I suppose they're a bit like Lego blocks or Meccano. So each cell comes with a battery tray that can be easily put together in groups. But I think that is probably one of the other from what I can see with the Teslas, that's one of the advantages as well. Even though the form factor is a bit of a disadvantage, having all of that work done is probably a good thing, I imagine.
Yeah, they do have the cooling loops built in into a neat package. They can be stacked into a big battery pack fairly easily. And yeah, they're good for range, but the only downside is if you're after a high voltage pack to match a high voltage motor, you do need quite a lot, almost the whole lot that's shown in that back of that tray picture, because they are about 25 volts per module. If you're running a 400 volt system, then you'd need, what's that, 12 to 16. So that adds up with a lot of weight and a lot of size, a lot of space that you need to find space for in your conversion. Other cell types can be better suited to getting higher voltage in a smaller form factor and less weight. So that's the only disadvantage with these. But if you're after long range, like I've seen some of the comments here that they still need long range, which for EV conversions, 200, 250, 300 kilometers is a long range for an EV conversion. The Tesla modules are going to be probably the best bet, depending on the car.
Yep, and I would tend to agree with that. Our first choice was Tesla for their energy density, but we're going to try and use an LG. I mentioned the Bmw i3 cells before, and what's attractive to me about them is that they've recently upgraded the performance of the cell, but it sits in exactly the same envelope. So if you had built a vehicle using the older cell, you could plug and play with the newer cell into it and get an immediate performance increase without having to re-engineer anything. And for me, that's the attraction of off-the-shelf.
So just for a comparison, what's the difference in ampere hours? So for argument's sake, these modules that we're looking at 25 volts, how many ampere hours are they?
I'd have to go back to the website and have a look. They're not quite there. There may be, the latest version is probably, I think, about 10% down. But both the LG and the i3 cells are creeping up to the Tesla cells in terms of performance and energy density. If you want a quick reference, go to Second Life EV, and they have got a battery page there where you can do a quick comparison. And I think they use an energy density metric, so you can compare like to like across different cells.
Yeah, the thing I've noticed that they don't tell you is DOC, depth of charge cycles. Yeah. They hide that. Everyone sort of assumes that if you have 5 kilowatt or 5.3 kilowatt Tesla modules, you can use, 25 or 26 kilowatts of energy. Well, you can't. Not if you don't love your cells. You can, I suppose, but you can't. It won't last very long. So, really the actual usage is also another thing to factor in.
Yeah, and look, I've just coming to the scene new. I've found that across the entire conversion world, and I think it's because it's so new. There is not a huge amount of standardization in terms of information.
I've got a question. I'm going to take some random questions here. Do converters use the liquid cooling in the Tesla modules? Yes, we do. The cooling loops are built into the modules that you see on the screen, and then we just create a new coolant pump system to pump the coolant through those battery packs. Another one from Greg are there any batteries coming out of China, or is it too hard? Mark or Conrad, do you know?
We use Chinese batteries. You take a bit of a gamble getting them across, and they're always happy to try and sell them to you in large amounts. But they're certainly not too bad to sell them once if you can get them through customs and all of that sort of stuff. Yeah, they work out nicely.
Yeah, I agree. The Porsche we helped out in Canberra with Renee, he did the pouches out of China, and he got them just air freighted in. I don't know how it happened, but he got them in, and he's got near on 30 kilowatts of pouch, which basically look like a LG pouch without the LG name, but they perform very well. So yeah, but it's a lot of work to make a battery with them too. It's a labour of love. Definitely.
And a question here about Tesla Model 3 cells. Are they worth seeking out? What we're looking at here are cells from a Model S or a Model X. The Model 3 cells are a completely different form factor. They're very long and not rigid like what we see in the modules on the screen. And so far, they're proving to be very difficult to repurpose into EV conversions. I know some of the workshops in the US or the UK are trying to work out a way to get them into a van or bus type conversions, but from what I understand, they're quite difficult. But Conrad, do you have any other?
Yeah, they because they're 1800 long, and there's two at over 100 volts and two under 100 volt modules. For total, Elon did do his homework on it, and like you say, they're not rigid. And I mean, I think they'd probably be good in a ute or a truck or a pickup truck. I do know of a couple of guys that have used them, but I know they do have to really try and stiffen them up because they tend to break tabs once they're out of the original Tesla box.
Yeah, so I'd say the summary at this point is that they're not quite worth seeking out, Jason, as your question was worded. There's another question about the age you can expect from these battery packs and when they would need to be replaced. It's a very good question. Hard to give a definitive answer, I would say. But look, some of the Tesla modules have racked up quite a few hundreds of thousands of miles in Tesla cars elsewhere around the world. How they've fared in EV conversions, hard to say. Anyone want to pipe in with some? Or Mark, you've given an answer already. Do you want to elaborate?
So one of the members of Ava here converted a Daihatsu Charade, probably around 2005-ish, maybe as late as 2008. But he certainly got it wasn't a very long range car. It was about 70 kilometres of range, but he used it daily, and he got easily 10 years out of it before he sold it and bought his first OEM electric car. And he had no real noticeable depreciation in the battery, but I dare say he was quite pedantic and was probably checking his BMS quite regularly and making sure everything was nice and balanced out. So, and they weren't anything flash. They were the old, I think, Headways or Winston cells. So,
yeah, I've got just trying to think. Our ute we sold a couple of years ago, we did 38,000 on that with the Winston cells, and I don't notice any degrading of range. You just have that winter-summer cycle, a bit more range in the summer, but less in the winter because of the cold. So, yeah, I guess like Tim said, there's Teslas up in the States. I've got a friend who's got one that he bought that had 468,000 miles on it, Model S, and it's only about 30 miles less in range than what they stated it came out with. So that's pretty impressive. And yeah, that's about all I can say, Tim.
Yeah, look, I think if you treat your batteries well and you use a good BMS, they should treat you well. That's how I'm approaching it.
Yeah.
Just on that as well, we sort of did a bit of I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but especially some of the earlier Teslas like the P65s and stuff like that, I'm under the impression that there was a fairly sort of standard battery that came out in a lot of those cars. So if they're using software to limit the range instead of the actual battery size, and especially if they're operating in the middle somewhere, like, from say 30 up to 80%, then those batteries could potentially last for a long time because they're not using that really rough bottom 10 or 20% and the top 10, 20. So that could also be, part of the trick about keeping batteries for a very long time.
Totally
Definitely.
agree.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, now we're going to have a bit of a deep dive with Peter and his Austin Healey Sprite conversion project. So over to you, Peter, to tell us more about what you're up to.
Okay, this is a project that I'm doing to help out a friend of mine who is too busy with work to actually convert his car, which is identical to this one. We've both been into Sprites. Well, I had my first Sprite in 1978. I started to drive in classic cars when I was 9 years old, so it's sort of been in my blood forever. And having had the same cars for that long gives you a very good idea of their capabilities and what they like and what they don't like. And if I can probably just step back, there are probably three main streams of why people convert to an EV. One is philosophical. I do it for the environment. I do it because it's good for the planet. I do it because it's sticking it up the oil companies, etc. So that's ideologically driven. There's the cool old car, and there's the alternative power unit, which is the way that we're looking at this one. And so what we started out to do, sticking it to the man, cool old car. So I'm convinced that the cool old car is the future of the classic car scene, because I use this Sprite 2 or 3 times a week if I can, and I'm constantly getting people saying, young kids saying, that's a cool car, that's a cool car, that's a cool car. They don't want to be involved though with changing gears. They don't want to know how to use a choke. They don't want a stinky oil burning engine. So the only way to get these kids into the classic car scene is to give them the cool car, but something that is a push button, stress-free, maintenance-free choice that fits with the way they're doing it. And so we looked at that, but that involves a lot of compromise, because what we wanted to do was to maintain the ethos and the spirit of the original car. Now these things weigh wet, they weigh about 690 kilos, and you can make them dance. They're like a ballerina. And if you were to just stick heaps and heaps of batteries in them to give them extra power, extra range, then you're killing the actual spirit of the car that attracted to you in the first place. So the way we're approaching it is, what will we do for an alternative power unit? And we're looking at it the same way as what would we do if we put a 4AGE into it, or a Honda K20. But in this case, we're looking at an electric engine, because Shane, who's the owner of the car, is actually in the autonomous electric vehicle field, and he is really interested to do this. But one thing about their company is you don't bring your hobby to work. And so he's doing it on his own, and I'm helping him. So the vision was to, maybe the next slide, please, Quinn. Okay, so we looked at it, and because both Shane and I come from a business background, we automatically sort of adopt a business case or a business case planning point of view. And so you start with a vision and then you work out the scope. And we said we wanted about 100 horsepower, which is about the maximum the chassis can take without a lot of modification, 150 k's range, and less than 5% weight gain on the 690 kilos. And also to use standard off-the-shelf components wherever we could, so that we could make use of the enclosures that OEM manufacturers have already built, so we could use the cooling plates that come out of Zero EV and all that sort of stuff. And part of the way that we work is, we go through a project methodology and we set the requirements, like, and this is one of the templates, as A, I need to, so I can, and the proof will be. And if you can ask and answer those questions, it'll help you with your planning. Plan, do, check, act comes from Deming, and Deming is the man who drove the quality improvements in the Japanese car industry back in the 60s. So you set your plan, you check what you're doing, doesn't meet your requirements, if not, then you act. And so at the moment, following that, we're currently, we've got a number of gates that we've got to go through. So, the first gate is, will the motor and the battery pack fit into the engine bay? Yes or no? If no, then the project is abandoned. If yes, then we move to the next stage of how do we configure it? How do we build the engine mounts? But what we've also done is that we've actually started with VSB 14, Vehicle Standards Bulletin 14, and we've consulted with the engineer at a very early stage. And the benefit of doing that is that you know exactly what you're up against in terms of certification and registration requirements. And I found VSB 14 really, really handy because it's actually a tiered set of criteria. So if you meet this, then you can pass. If you don't meet this, then you go to the next step, which means you might need to, for example, to fit 2-speed wipers and windscreen demisting. And that works on the power, it works on the weight, it works on the suspension modifications. And the benefit of engaging your engineer really, really early is that they have probably done this sort of thing before, and they can point you to people who can help you. And I'm working with Rowan Carter, and he's pointed me to a guy that did an MGB conversion, who has been very helpful when it comes to the enclosures and what types of cells and what type of performance. And the EV Alliance, hooking up with the EV Alliance is probably one of the most important things that we've done. So we're looking at a plug and play or an off-the-shelf battery, which is an LG module. These are used by Jaguar Land Rover, and they come out of India. And one of the gates that we set was to have local battery supply. And we were having trouble finding local batteries, but we think we may now have found a local source for these. They're a really good size. They stack really well in the Sprite. Our first choice was the Tesla cell, but they're 700mm long, whereas the maximum space we've got available safely is 460mm. So the Tesla cell is out of the picture. And I reckon that I could probably stack 10 of these in the engine bay of the Sprite, which you can just see in the background of the slide there, to give us 26 kilowatt hours at about 120 kilos weight. And the weight of the engine and ancillaries is 115 kilos. So that gives us pretty much one-to-one replacement value in terms of weight. We're looking at using what's the next slide, please? I've forgotten where we're up to. We're looking at using the Hyper 9, 120 volt, and using it for indirect drive. A couple of reasons for that is that there is no room for the motor and the gearbox. However, the car being so light means that it's going to be really, really easy for the motor to drive. And the Sprite has got a choice of 7 different diff ratios, so that we can tailor the performance and the speed that we want to get. Standard, they come with a 4.2 to 1 diff, and we're probably going to drop back to a 4.5 to 1 to get the performance we want. But if we wanted, we could go up to a moonshot diff of 3.5, which means that the motor would be barely ticking over. Now, the motor sits in almost exactly the same spot as the gearbox does. The gearbox is 20 kilos, the motor is 50 kilos. And so there's the additional 30 kilos of weight that we were planning on. And once you take out other things, like you take out the fuel tank and you take out the allowance for a full tank of fuel, we're thinking that the rest of the ancillaries will balance up that, and will probably come out at about 710 kilos, which would still make it a really, really delightful thing to drive. But the motor is one of our gates. If that doesn't let us fit the batteries between the chassis rails, then we'll probably have to reevaluate what we're doing. Because one of the things is, if you're doing a classic car, you don't want to cut things out to make temporary things fit in, because you don't know how the cycle of power units is going to come around. And in the classic car scene, it's moving more and more towards the antique scene, where you want to retain as much of the original fabric of the vehicle as you possibly can, because that will help maintain its value. If we could probably move on to the next slide, please. This is a current Sprite conversion that's out of the US. Now, I think they're using a Curtis motor in theirs, and they're using some weird and wonderful battery from somewhere. And you can see the cradle there they've built is between the rails, but it's actually sitting quite high, and they've got an additional battery pack sitting up on the shelf where the original 12-volt battery sat. And it's really, really important to be able to learn from conversions like this, because these people in particular have gone to a lot of thought about what they're going to do. There are some really, really manky conversions come out of the US, where they've added 200 kilos of extra weight to a Sprite or a midget, which is just crazy. And you'd never actually get the thing certified in Australia. But then, as Clive James said, America is a good place to keep the Americans. Can we have the next slide, please? Okay, and here's the finished article. It's a pretty neat job, but what I'm not fond of in this one is that they've concentrated a lot more weight higher up in the car than I would like. Because when you look at the way a car is designed, it's designed to rotate around the wheel centers and around, in this case, a rear-wheel drive car, around the tail shaft. And so when you start adding extra weight further away from those rotating axes, you're going to get far more effect on the way the car drives and handles and its safety on the road. And so I'm confident that with the conversion we're planning, we can have the battery packs all sitting about the height of the charge box that's in front of the battery pack there, which is about the height of the original engine that comes out of the car. And if we can make that work, then it will be fab. If I can't fit the 10 in the engine bay, I'll put 2 in the boot and just keep 8 in the engine bay. And so are there any questions so far about that? No. The one thing I found from talking to people who've done this is that in the MGB that I spoke of earlier, the owner has to drive it around in third gear to get the performance they want. And so it's something to think about when you're planning the conversion is what sort of gearing is going to be available to you to get acceptable performance out of the motor. And in something like the Austin 1800 that I think got mentioned a little bit earlier, that's going to be a little more difficult because I think they may have only had one final drive ratio available in that. And so that's something to think about there. I reckon that would be ideal for a small Tesla unit to go in the front, and then you could bypass the gearbox altogether. And the other benefit of that is the 1800's got one of the strongest passenger cells produced in the 60s and 70s. So it's a very, very safe car. Could we have the next slide, please? And here's me. I reckon that converting old cars is going to be the future for the classic car scene. And I think that the challenge is that OEMs are putting a lot of time and effort and money into higher and higher voltage components and power packs. And I think the risk is that the way that the current motors and batteries are, the classic car scene is at risk maybe of getting left behind a bit. Yeah, thanks, Greg. It is a lovely car. And I keep getting harassed by attractive young women when I'm in the traffic. I can only think it's me, not the car, but you know, that's not for me to say. And so unless...
That's great, Peter. Thanks
Yeah.
for running us through that. We've got a good question from Jason in relation to your design plans.
Yep.
The question is, he thought it was generally a bad idea to go direct to the differential.
It's not a bad idea. The American Sprite conversions do it direct. There are many other cars that do it direct. You can adjust your power delivery curve so you don't get a sudden wallop at the back. But when you think that the diff in a car is handling all the torque and all the horsepower all the time, it's actually really a very robust unit. And I think particularly, you know, if we're looking at the Hyper 9, the Hyper 9 has got, what, 173 foot-pound of torque. The most powerful standard version of the Sprite had 72 foot-pound of torque. A Sprite gearbox won't live with 173 foot-pound of torque going through it, whereas the diff will. So I think that direct drive would be my preference wherever I could, because it reduces complexity and it improves driveline efficiency, because in a rear-wheel drive car, in an ICE situation, you're losing about 30% of your power through the drivetrain, through the gearbox and through the drive shaft and the diff. So if you can eliminate one of those power sapping components, you'll get better range and better performance. But in terms of that, yes, you can get road vibration coming back through the motor and affecting the internal components of the motor. So one of my thoughts is to use the rubber donut, similar to used in Alfa Romeos and BMWs, as a vibration balancer that goes between the components, which will not only help reduce mechanical wear, but it also reduces the amount of vibration coming through the car body. But it's a good question. If it was an auto, I would probably want to retain the automatic gearbox so that I had the variable ratios in the gearbox rather than having to swap the diff. But I think that's a different story. That's for the Volvo that I want to do next. Now the Sprite doesn't have an overdrive. it's just got a straight 4-speed gearbox. The transmission tunnel is too narrow for an overdrive. But you know, the idea of an overdrive is attractive because you can actually buy a standalone overdrive, and it's got in it an epicyclic gear train, which is similar to the gear train that Zero EV have built for the back of their motors. But overdrives run off a hydraulic pump, and they don't like to spin at much more than 5,500 revs. And so if you're putting 12 or 14,000 RPM through it with an EV, the overdrive drops out. But that can be fixed, but that's a different story.
And Peter, what's your plan for top speed and acceleration expectations?
If we can get 100 horsepower out of the motor, then in a car this size, it's what I call stupid fast. Aerodynamically, it probably won't do much more than what's 120 miles an hour in the old money, but acceleration wise it would be frightening. In this actual blue car that you can see here, I had a 100 horsepower ICE engine, and with a 4.5 diff it was unruly on the road, to say the least. So I actually put a 3.7 diff in it, which helped quieten it down. Which is the benefit of a light car, but you know, the paradox is that the bigger and heavier the car, the easier it is to convert and get the performance you want. Stuart, I think I was talking about the Tesla small drive unit, which replaces the gearbox and the engine in a front wheel drive or rear engine, rear wheel drive context.
Peter, did you mention about considering placing cells in the rear if you run out of space in the front?
I did. One thing that I'm particularly cognizant of is weight distribution. If we fit all the cells in the front, then we put all the other bits and pieces in the back, and that maintains the 47-53 weight distribution in the car. And one thing I didn't mention was that the American EV conversion you saw there boosted the weight up to 760 kilos, which is, and that bug-eye is 635 kilos dry, so 690 wet. So they're adding a huge amount of weight, and they're only getting 130 kilometres range out of it. But yes, one of the joys of the Sprite is its balance. And so one of the things we'll do with the components is shift them around until we maintain the balance that we want.
Fantastic. Thanks for that, Peter. I think we've got to all the questions related directly to your conversion, but we still do have a few other general Q&As, which I'm going to open up to the panel. I'll start off with Jamie's question. What is your view on the modern MGB conversions being done with the Continental OEM driveline, you know, in a custom subframe under the back with a battery box in the engine bay and transmission tunnel? If you're not aware, that's the rbwevcars.com being produced in the UK. Conrad, are you familiar with these?
Only what I've seen on the tube. They look all right. I guess the thing with those retrofits is they're using high voltage, and high voltage gives you a lot more RPM, lower your gear ratio to like 9.5 to 1. So just to compare with Peter's, Mark will know this, we did a conversion on a little orange MEV kit car out of the UK, and that had a 165 horsepower twin HPV motor direct drive through a 5.3 diff, and it wasn't stunning. It was good, but top end was better than low end. So you're going to have to. Personally, I would be doing closer to a 6 to 1 reduction to to get that motor and the efficiency of where you're going to use it. And you know yourself, Tim, with that sort of stuff. But getting back to your original question with the OEM stuff, I think, if you can play with 360 volts and bolt in something that's a plug and play system, yeah, it's definitely a nice way to go.
The only question I'd have about that is getting the thing registered and approved, because you're then substantially altering the original suspension and drive line. But in terms of the concept of the design, absolutely, I think they're a fantastic thing, and more strength to them. But it's my only concern there.
Great. Okay. Another question from Oliver. He has 40 Samsung SDI NGM nickel cadmium cells for his Suzuki Vitara. Do you have any recommendations for a BMS that is easy to set up and has good instrumentation visibility? Mark, do you want to field that?
We're mostly familiar with Batrium and the Ziva BMSs. The Batrium's not as easy to set up. It certainly has a lot more features and all of that sort of stuff. So I'd actually probably go towards the Ziva, but the downside of the Ziva, it's a lot easier to manage. It's kind of a brick. It works nicely, but it doesn't do the balancing as well.
Yeah, it does now, Mark.
Okay.
We use Ziva on our high voltage stuff and low voltage, and it does balance. And Ziva will probably in the next month do CCS2 with our module out of Zero EV in the UK. They'll talk to it. So it's just another option apart from Orion, which is a nice system but really expensive.
Yeah, I use the Orion. It is expensive, but it is a very good BMS. But yeah, there's a few options that can match various budget points. But it is very important that you get a BMS that you're comfortable with. It has the features that you need at the price that you're after. Okay, I'm just going to touch over some of the other questions before we still got a few minutes left. Dion asked, is there a weight limit for how many batteries you can fit into a said car? Example, extra range. Well, weight limit is very important in relation to keeping the original suspension and brake systems and keeping within the original GVM, because that will make getting it engineered and roadworthy far easier. So I think, as Mark has typed in there, the best bet is to try and match the original weight of the car as much as possible. If you do go over a little bit, you may have to reduce your seating capacity if you don't upgrade the suspension or brake. In my Cortina, I went a little bit over the only by a small amount. It's still the final finished weight was around 1,000 kilos compared to maybe 920 or so stock. And our engineer just when I had the mod plate done for the modifications, just reduced it down to a 4-seater instead of a 5. That was fine for me, and was only planning to put 4 new seat belts in anyway, new retractable seat belts. So that was all fine. I'm still within the GVM limits of the car. Anything else to add about weight limits for how many batteries? Anyone else on the panel?
I think you've nailed it. I think the key is to aim for the original vehicle weight, because otherwise you get into a whole lot of strife. Yeah.
Here's a great question from Jason. Are there any types of car to avoid converting? Great question. There's a lot you should avoid, in my opinion. But well, look, generally anything modern is going to be far more complex, and anything that, like Mark says, that doesn't hold any particular value, either sentimental or monetary value, probably best to avoid because it will be a big process and a lot of money to convert. So it's only generally worth doing for something that holds sentimental value or holds some classic car value. That's just my opinion. Anyone else want to chime in on what to avoid?
On that note, Tim, EV Alliance is going to release, after the HV voltage course that we've just released, we're going to release another course string of, and the first module will be on choosing an EV to DIY and the pros and cons and what to avoid and not to avoid, to accept and use, because we get these questions daily, and like you sort of said, modern cars that you have a bit of sentimental attachment to. So yeah, that module will be quite good for people that are considering looking at maybe wanting to do a DIY conversion, and a bit of a point of start of the journey, and that will evolve into actually doing the conversion. So it'll be quite a good course content. So I see Emma's just put up there. So we released a week and a half ago our online training for our higher voltage training course for EVs. It's a introductory course, takes about an hour and a half. And I recommend anyone that's considering doing an EV conversion or working on EVs, whether it be on a daily basis or just once in their life, to go and do this short course. And we highly recommend it. We put a lot of effort into it, and we think it's a pretty good overview of where to start with working on your EV or working with EVs, Tim.
Fantastic. Quick question. Any experience with EMUS BMS out of Lithuania? I don't have any. Anyone have any experience with EMUS BMS?
No, I've only heard of it. I know someone that has, so I can't give you a yay or nay. I think with BMSs, wherever you are, you've got to look at, if you're DIYing your BMS, it'll be a price point and a backup point. There's no point buying a cheap BMS and you can't get help with your questions or to install it, or they don't back the product up. So that would be a huge thing I would consider. Well, I do consider, because we've done so many different types of BMSs. So now I just stick to a few where I know I can get help and support, as well as a good price point.
Okay, the remaining questions, I think we're going to wrap up now, and we'll have to answer those next time. There's some good questions there that we could talk on and on about all night, but we've run out of time, I'm afraid. So thanks everybody for the fantastic questions and interaction. It's been a really good session. Thanks, Peter, for going through your project. If anyone wants to contact anyone directly, you can see their social media contacts on the screen now, but I would just want to give a call out to the EV Alliance that's organizing these chats and the training course sessions. And I truly encourage everyone to get involved and subscribe to the EV Alliance and be involved. And thanks, Emma, and everyone for organizing tonight. Thanks, Peter, Mark,
Thank
and
you.
Conrad.
Thank you. Thanks.
And
Thank you.
please join us for the next one next month.